The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everyone, this is Jennifer Wilson. I am here at the University of Illinois and I will be your facilitator for today's webinar. This is the first in a new series of webinars for the two US EPA Innovative Treatment Technologies for Small System Centers, DeRISK and WINS, with also in conjunction with our sister organization RESEAU in Canada. We're excited to bring researchers together to share what they're working on as part of these projects. Each month we'll have 3 presenters for the next few months, and we're excited to get this going again. We did a previous series, and we think this is going to be really fun. We're going to do a couple different things, and I will go over that in one moment. Let's see here. All right. So as I said, there's going to be 3 presenters. They'll each speak for 20 minutes, and we're going to do something weird with the Q&A. Instead of having you submit written Q&A, which then the presenter would only have a one-sided response, we're going to do something with social media. We're going to ask you to jump on LinkedIn, and I'll go over that in just a minute. This webinar will be recorded, and we're going to post it on our joint center's website, drinkingwatercenters.net. And it'll be shared also through our social channels and in our next newsletter. As I mentioned before, we're here at the University of Illinois, and we're the ones that produce the newsletter that goes out once a month for the centers. So we have a LinkedIn group, and it's called Tech for Small Water with the number. That's also the same as our Twitter handle, Tech for Small Water. And we've not done anything with the group yet. So we're going to take this as an experiment. We're going to ask you to jump on to this group. You'll have to request to join, and we'll be standing by to approve you. But there you can ask questions of our presenters. And we hope to do this throughout the series so that not only do you have that one-sided Q&A here, what you really have is an opportunity for ongoing back and forth discussion where you can really dig into the details of your questions and support each other in this work. I'll ask that you create a new thread for each question, and we'll see how it goes. And so we're very much encouraging you to participate in this experiment, and I think that it's a great opportunity to do something a little different, and it also will allow those who view this presentation as a recording to jump in and participate in that conversation. We have 3 presenters here today, one from each of the 3 centers. We have Joshua Alvey from the University of Alaska, from the DeRISK Center, Pranav Chintalapati from the University of British Columbia, representing RESEAU, and Hamid Zad from WINS at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. So I will turn it over to Josh to get started. All right, Josh, you have the mic.
Thank you, Jennifer. All right, hello everyone. I'll just go ahead and jump right into it so we can save time. Hey, Jennifer, can I close this?
You can minimize the GoToWebinar screen if it's in the way. There's a little arrow toggle.
Oh, I see. All right.
Because we cannot see it.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so like Jennifer said, my name is Josh Alvey. I'm with the DeRISK Center, and I'm a student at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Today I'll be talking to you about the applications of a ceramic membrane and UV oxidation system that we developed here in Anchorage. And so just to give you a little bit of background about our technology vision behind the project, what we were trying to do is we were trying to combine multiple unit processes into a single unit process. And so our idea was we were going to take in a tubular membrane and insert a UV lamp through the annular orifice. And so by that we would be able to minimize the path length of UV light exposure, and we would also be able to hopefully ideally utilize a concentration polarization layer, which is developed when a fluid flows over a surface. You get a concentration gradient, and then that concentration gradient that's developed the high concentration gradient that develops near the surface of the surface, or in this case the membrane, would allow increased exposure to UV light. So we were thinking that by combining these processes there might be some additional benefits as opposed to having these processes treat water separately. And so through the goals of the DeRISK Center, we first had to create a bin scale, and then we were going to maybe tweak and alter the design of the bin scale, and ultimately it would lead to a pilot system where we would test in actual field situations. And so first I'll go through some of the developments that led some of the developments of our bin scale system. And so when we initially created the bin scale, it wasn't exactly as we had envisioned, but we wanted to test the technology, and we wanted to determine if there were additional benefits of having one single unit process. And so essentially what we had at the beginning was just a hunk of solid stainless steel split into 4 sections. And those 4 sections where we had all the way on the left-hand side at the bottom of the screen, you'll see a UV lamp cooling sleeve. And this section was just to, if we wanted to, we could provide a heat exchange for the UV lamp. 2, we also had a UV lamp mount, and the 3rd section was the reactor cell. And essentially, there was no contact of the liquid with the UV lamp. And so on the top of that reactor cell, there was a piece of glass, and then underneath that glass is where the fluid would flow. And then at the very bottom, which is the far right side of the screen, that was the membrane support. So the fluid would flow into the reactor cell underneath that glass, and then it would be directed down through the membrane, and then out the fitting on that 4th section there. And so this was just the basic idea. This was just us trying to test our idea relatively cheaply, and then we would go from there. And so just to give you an idea of scale, the lamps were extremely small. And so during our initial tests, this is just a basic schematic of the system. We had a pump, and the pump fed the reactor, or fed into that membrane system. And we also had a recirculation loop if we wanted to use it. However, for all the initial experiments, we didn't even utilize it. And then, that reactor, the effluent from the reactor went to a UV detector, and that's how we did most of our initial experiments, just using UV. And so the initial setup, was we had multiple types of lamps. So we had a low pressure UV, and we had a vacuum UV lamp, and we had, initially we only had ceramic membranes. And these were just 47 millimeter in diameter disc membranes. They were composed primarily of titanium dioxide. And so they were 15 kilodaltons, and with ceramic membranes, you have large pH tolerances, and they can pretty much tolerate any kind of chemical you can throw at them in terms of oxidants. And so one of our hypotheses was, if we have a large DOM component in the water, we might be able to reduce membrane fouling on the surface, or fouling on the surface of the membrane, because we've got this possible photocatalytic oxidation that could occur because these membranes are composed of titanium dioxide and exposed to UV light. And then secondly, we thought, hey, not only could we reduce maybe DOM, but we also might see an improved effect on pollutant degradation, such as micropollutants. Whereas we wouldn't see these effects if we just treated, typically we would treat, removing pollutants through membrane filtration, and then possibly, how typical water treatment utilizes UV for photolytic degradation. And so these initial experiments led us up to the final test, in these hypotheses and initial experiments I did show actually led us up to our main experiment for the bench scale test, and that was a micropollutant decay analysis. And we were just looking at parent compounds, but we looked at the parent compounds of 17 micropollutants, just a whole cocktail of them. We had multiple conditions, so we looked at a condition where we treated the water only with membranes, only with UV lamps, and that includes both low pressure and vacuum UV lamps. Then we looked at the combination of the two processes, and finally we wanted to determine maybe if dose could influence, UV dose could influence the decay of the micropollutants. And so what we did there was we altered the flow rate. And so a low flow rate, right, equals a high dose because it spends more time in the reaction chamber, and high flow rate equals a low dose. And specifically, the high dose was like 345 millijoules per centimeter squared, and the low dose was around 200, I believe, millijoules per centimeter squared. And so these are a list of all the compounds I'll show you today. I think there's mostly, this is most of them. And so to give you an example of one of the experiments, I've taken a compound sucralose, and on the left-hand side you'll see the final concentration over the initial concentration. On the right-hand side you'll see all the different conditions. So we've got, and this is only for low pressure UV. So I've got a membrane, no membrane, or no UV, and then you've got certain no membrane scenarios, and then you've got, you know, both of the processes combined. And so once I go through this, you'll see that it's not that difficult. So first we'll look at a membrane without any UV. And because we were using 15 kilodalton membranes, we weren't really expecting any membrane filtration removal given the size of the sucralose molecule. Now, when you have just the low pressure UV lamp, even at high and low doses, it doesn't matter. You still really don't get much removal. But when we combine both the membrane and the low pressure UV lamp, we start to see removal. And so the red is, you know, the low dose, and the high is the high dose, or the green is the high dose. And so we start to see, you know, somewhat of an additional benefit or synergistic effects here. And so if we look at that same molecule under vacuum UV, in general we'll see the same trends. So if we just have the membrane, we really don't get any removal. If we just have the lights without the membrane, we can already see that we have some removal. Whereas before, with the low pressure, we didn't see that we had any removal. And that's probably because of the 185 nanometer light that vacuum UV emits. And so, you know, we're generating ozone, we're probably having photocatalytic effects. I mean, not here, but, you know, because of that, we would eventually have photocatalytic effects probably. And so, you know, when we add the membrane, we can see increased additional improvement. So, you know, as before with just the light, we're seeing roughly 40% removal. Now we're seeing additional 20% removal when we add both the membrane and the lights. And it's important to notice that there's not much of additional benefit between, at least for vacuum UV, between the no membrane and light scenario versus the membrane and light scenario. But when we look at trimethoprim, we'll see that that is not the case. And so again, this is a same scenario, same setup, just showing you a different molecule. Where we have, here's the low pressure, and here we have the membrane only, then we have the lights only, and then finally when we add the scenario, the membrane and the lights together, you can see the, you know, a drastic increase in improvement. Whereas before, you know, the difference between these two scenarios wasn't as great in sucralose, but, you know, here in trimethoprim, it's about a 40% improvement or synergistic effect. And so when we have the vacuum UV, you essentially see the same trend, except the only difference being that there's a lot more removal with vacuum UV. And now I will show you the low pressure results for all of the compounds today, and you can see the trends are pretty much the same throughout all the compounds. dose plays a little bit of a difference, but more importantly, the largest variable that has an improvement upon degradation is the combination of the membrane and the light. And then again, the same scenario for vacuum UV, except you just get more removal. And so some of the conclusions are, we think there are additional benefits to having this in one single unit process versus two separate processes, as is conventional in water treatment. So this may propose the opportunity for in situ cleaning, whereas you could reduce valence on the surface of the membrane, especially when you consider vacuum UV light. And vacuum UV light does have the largest effect on reducing concentrations of micropollutants, which is what we found. And this is probably likely because of the photochemical reactions that are occurring on the surface of the membrane, on the surface of the membrane caused by the UV light. And we did XRD analysis, and it suggested the surface of the membrane was rutile. And I mean, the manufacturer, it's pretty common for ceramic membranes, certain ceramic membranes, to utilize titanium dioxide in not only their support layers, but their active layer as well. And so some of the possible reaction processes for the decay of these pollutants, you get direct oxidation from pollutants adsorbed to the surface of the membrane. You can also have the indirect oxidation through radicals and ozone. And you can get direct photolytic degradation, thanks to the UV light. And so the pilot scale, when we look at the pilot scale now, because once we had finished that experiment, we moved on. We're like, okay, we need to start constructing the pilot scale, so that way we can really put this thing in the field and try to realize our initial design. And so again, this was our initial design, where you can see this is the lamp, this would be the membrane, and then this outer black ring would be the membrane, the whole actual reactor housing. And so we also knew that we wanted to mount this on a skid, and so that way it's easily transportable, and we wanted to make sure we utilize the recirculation at this time. And so the pilot scale, we're going to have two types of membranes, silicon carbide this time, and the ceramic, composed primarily of titanium dioxide. Both types of lamps again, it's all stainless steel, and it's got a 1/2 horsepower motor. And so this, on the left-hand side, is what the inside of the membrane housing looks like. And on the right-hand side over here, this fitting, that is where the lamp is inserted. And it's inserted through the length of this, this housing, and the water flows in through here. So it's got initial contact with just UV, and then it goes into the housing with the membrane and the UV light. And this is the reactor housing mounted on our skid. It's kind of hard to see, but essentially right up here the light is inserted in again through the membrane housing, and that's essentially what it looks like on the right hand side in the housing itself. And this is the complete pilot system. And it's all wired up, so you've got influent here at the top, you've got permeate coming out the bottom left side, and the concentrate comes out the right side. These two boxes over here, well, you only see one, but there's actually another one behind the one you see, and that's our 120 volt to run the pump and the lights. And then we've got this whole big box is a 12 volt box for all the sensors and power supply of the sensors. And that's the setup in the lab. And the only thing notable here is we obviously had to mount, at least with this pump head, we had to mount, provide a platform for the influent, because it needs positive head in order for the pump to not cavitate. And very quickly, we had, some of the things we want to do is we want to repeat some of the proof of concepts from the bench experiments. And we want to evaluate the effectiveness of the different type of membranes as well as the lights. We also want to look at the transformation of DOM, and we want to look at the fouling rates of the membranes with and without lights, and possibly look at the destruction of HAA and THM precursors in the system. And some potential issues that we know we may run into, we've got inorganic fouling as one, specifically scaling. You can have lamp fouling, suspended solids, which leads to light scattering, which could reduce the effectiveness of the UV. And we also could have absorption of the light by DON. So obviously there's a component here of pre-treatment that may be necessary to ultimately utilize the full capacity of the system. And then, of course, you know, right now where we're at is I'm finalizing some of the code for all of the sensors to read the data accurately, or to be able to generate data accurately, I should say. And I mean, the system works physically. I just need to work out some of the data details. And then, you know, of course, we could look ahead to full scale and think of things like, you know, packing factor and costs and energy and such. And so quickly, I just want to thank some of these sponsors, which of course is the EPA, and I'd also like to thank UAA for laboratory assistance and the Southern Nevada Water Authority as well. And thank you. That's all my contact information. Please feel free to contact me, you know, whenever convenient.
All right, thanks a lot, Josh. If you could hand off the presentership, we'll get in right to the next presentation. And again, thanks everyone for joining us on the webinar today. This will be recorded if you do need to step away. And we're going to ask you to submit any questions for the presenters to our LinkedIn group. That link was available at the beginning of the presentation, and I'll also be sending it out 1 hour after this webinar if you don't have it yet. All right. Okay. All right, the floor is yours.
Okay, hello everyone. So my name is Pranav Chintalapati. I'm a master's student at UBC working with Professor Mitchell. Okay, so my presentation is on the treatment of microsystem LR, one of the common algal toxins, using vacuum heat. Okay, so if you were to just Google cyanobacterial blooms and just go over to the news section, you would probably see quite a few headlines and articles about these blooms that have been popping up all over North America and the world. So I did this not too long ago and found several articles about cyanobacterial blooms. And if you look at the dates, it's just, you know, the end of September here. And you know, kind of drastic titles, right? Toxic algae blooms are occurring more frequently and lasting longer. And typically these articles will have some indication of this being unprecedented, you know, the highest number in history, and typically they will mention climate change. Now, a number of studies have come out linking climate change to the acceleration of cyanobacterial growth. The US EPA has released a report on this, and then this is just an image from another study that was done last year, looking at cyanobacterial growth trends in North America and Europe. So, the reason that this can be a problem is that many cyanobacterial blooms contain toxins that can be harmful to human health. And so microcystin LR, MCLR, is one of the most commonly occurring variants of this toxin. It's a hepatotoxin, which means it accumulates in the liver. And the challenge with these toxins is that they can exist both within the algae cells and dissolved in the water surrounding them. So that means we need to have some kind of physical treatment for the cells, and then some kind of oxidation for the dissolved toxins. And if you live in a large community, some of you may be familiar with the tap water ban in Toledo, Ohio, city of 500,000 people. You know, they were actually able to alleviate their tap water ban within a few days because they have a large conventional system. And so by introducing some pre-oxidation using permanganate and adjusting their chlorine dosage, they were able to solve their problem. But At RESEAU, we work with communities that are quite small, and many of them have been on tap water ban or boil water advisory for several years just because they don't have the infrastructure to treat their water quality issues. So I should mention MCLR in Health Canada, the guideline is 1.5 part per billion. In the US, I believe the guideline is 1.6 for all microsystems for adults, and I think it's lower for infants, like less than 1.5 or something like that. Okay, so as I mentioned with RESEAU, we tend to do, we focus our work on technologies that are appropriate for small water systems, and often these water systems are in very remote communities. The pictures at the bottom are from a pilot test that we did in a place called Van Anda, which is about an 8 to 10 hour trip from Vancouver. You have to take 3 ferries, and each ferry gets progressively smaller. So it's beautiful in the summer, but in the wintertime, it can be quite a challenge to access. And this is not a unique situation for some of the water systems we work with. So if these systems were dependent on chemical oxidants, then it may be difficult to always maintain a consistent supply. So that kind of led us to look at chemical-free options. And so when we look at different kinetic studies that have been done with oxidants and MCLR, we see that the hydroxyl radical has very rapid reaction rates with MCLR, and that kind of is what led us to vacuum UV, since it is a chemical-free way of generating these hydroxyl radicals. So I know Josh touched on it, but just for those who are unfamiliar, when we talk about vacuum UV, what we're talking about are ultraviolet photons that are at wavelengths below 200 nanometers. So the term vacuum comes from the fact that if you transmit sub-200 nanometer photons, they'll react with the oxygen in the air and generate ozone, so they don't really transmit very far. And so under vacuum conditions is historically how these experiments have been done. In our case, we don't use vacuum conditions, we purge with nitrogen, but the name still sticks. So the lamps we use are emitting 185 and 254 nanometers. So we have some UVC and we have some vacuum UV. And that is actually beneficial because it allows us 2 different pathways for pollutant degradation. So if we have a solution of water with our pollutant and we irradiate with vacuum UV lamps, then we have photons at 2 wavelengths. And by doing so, the 185 nanometer gets absorbed by the water, reacts with the water to generate the hydroxyl radical, and the hydroxyl radical can then oxidize the pollutant. Now, depending on the UV absorbance of the pollutant of interest, then you may also get some direct photolysis, where the molecule is absorbing the 254 nanometer as well, and then that's another means of degradation. Now, in real life, we don't usually just have water and the pollutant that we're interested in getting rid of. There's usually some other components like organics or alkalinity, and in this case, depending on what it is, the absorbance may affect the amount of 254 available to be absorbed by the pollutant, and it may also scavenge the hydroxyl radical, so this will impede the degradation. So what we're interested in knowing is, well, how does vacuum UV work on microsystem LR? It hasn't been tested before. And how resilient is it when you have other components in your water, like organics? So this is the setup we're doing. We're doing small batch experiments with a little reactor vessel. The lamp is housed inside that black casing on the bottom there. We're purging with nitrogen, which is what that bottom little tube is. So these are some of the results that we've seen. So this first plot is just MCLR spiked into pure deionized water. And so typical algal bloom concentrations, 10 to 20, sometimes up to 50 part per billion. And like we said before, our guideline target is 1.5 part per billion. So For those familiar with UV dose and UV disinfection, the x-axis is our 254 nanometer dose. And typically when we do UV disinfection, we target 40 millijoules per centimeter squared to damage the DNA of microorganisms and prevent replication and prevent pathogens from spreading. So what we see is that we're getting MCLR degradation at relatively low UV doses around the same range of what you would apply for disinfection, which is actually quite promising. Now, if we introduce other components like chloride, we don't see a really big effect here. We tested 5 ppm and 50 ppm chloride, and slight impedance caused by potentially hydroxyl radical scavenging. The chloride doesn't add much to the absorbance of the solution, so it shouldn't really affect direct photolysis too much, but more or less not a huge impact. With alkalinity, we see a little bit more impedance here. So, we were degrading to no MCLR with a dose of 40 millijoules when we didn't have other stuff in the water. Now with alkalinity, we're needing to get at least 60 or 90 millijoules per centimeter squared before we see no more MCLR. With organics, again, now we're starting to see some more impedance and some more scavenging. I should point out that as you add organics to the water, it increases the UV absorbance of the solution. So we adjust for that. We account for that by exposing higher concentrations to longer time periods in order to achieve the same UV dose. So it's corrected for the same UV dose. And so what we see is that we still get fairly good degradation occurring even at very high DOC concentrations like 8 ppm, but now we're over to 120 before we see complete degradation at the higher concentration. So those are what we call synthetic waters, right? We're taking pure deionized water, we're spiking with known concentrations. In this case, now we're looking at a natural water. So this is a lake water, actually taken from that community Van Anda, where we were doing some pilot testing. And this is a more complex water matrix. So we have 6 ppm DOC, we have fairly high alkalinity, there's some chlorides there, there's also sulfates. I forgot to put the number on there, but it's around 15 to 20, I believe. So, and again, now we see that having these other components, it definitely affects how well we can degrade MCLR, but we see complete degradation by 200 millijoules per centimeter squared. So slowly, as the water gets more complex with these additional components, the dose requirement is getting higher and higher. So these were all batch tests, but when we're at the site, we could do some testing with a continuous flow reactor. So that's the reactor on the side there. It's fairly small, about 200 milliliter reactor volume, but it allows us to test the continuous process at different flow rates. So that's what we did. So this is showing 3 different flow rates tested on 3 different water conditions. And I have the residence time here to give some perspective. So the first water condition was basically just the water as it was. We took some lake water, spiked with MCLR, and then tested 3 different flow rates. And you can see kind of the general trend that we would expect. As you increase the flow rate, you get a little bit less removal, but granted with overlapping error bars, there may not be such a huge difference. The next test, now we didn't know what the alkalinity was at the time. I just kind of grabbed a sample of water, spiked MCLR. So I wanted to test it with additional components as well. So I added an additional 40 ppm of alkalinity, not knowing that I already had 70 to begin with. And so that's kind of what the second test is there. And then the third water that we did was basically just dosed an additional amount of chlorine. So now we have 50 ppm chloride, and then so I mean nothing particularly surprising here, but just kind of a general sense of how the different fluorides are working and the types of degradation that we can still see. Okay, so that's kind of what's been done. What we're working on right now is testing algal bloom water. So our friends at École Polytechnique in Montreal were kind enough to send us some samples of water that has algal cells in it. And what we're looking at is how degradation is affected by the presence of algal cells. So the implication would be that if your pre-screening or your filtering didn't get out all of the Alvey cells, well, if you had a few come through, what would the effect be, and how much would that impact MCLR degradation if you used vacuum UVs? So our conclusions, well, we found that vacuum UV is quite effective in degrading MCLR. We were able to get it below Health Canada guidelines, even in complex water matrix situations. We do see impedance caused by natural organic matter and alkalinity. And one thing I touched on, I didn't really show the data on it, but we found that degradation is occurring both by direct photolysis and advanced oxidation. We tested MCLR and found that it has a fairly high molar absorbance coefficient for 254, and that degradation is occurring by both methods. So just a thank you to my colleagues here in our group, and as well as Benoit Barbeau's group at Polytechnique Montreal, and CERC, and then of course RESEAU Water Method.
All right, thank you.
Yep.
If you could change the presentership to Hamid, we will continue on. Perfect, thank you. Let's continue on with our third presentation.
All right. My name is Hamid. I am from University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and what I'm going to talk about today is a part of a project from Water Innovation Network for Sustainable Small Systems, which is about a distributed sensing and monitoring of systems, application to SWTR compliance and point-of-use devices, development of a new inexpensive disposable sensor with a specific utility for small systems. This project has a long-term goal, which is development of a cost-effective, user-friendly, and reusable sensor for real-time and continuous monitoring of nitrate in real complex environment. The project also has an immediate goal, which is what I'm going to talk about today, which is about systematic characterization and optimization of a silver-based electrochemical nitrate sensor. So in this case, I'm going to talk about two types of nitrate sensors. The first type is about a nanostructured silver-modified ultramicro-electrode, and the second one is about a nanoparticle silver-modified disposable paper electrodes. But importance of measuring nitrate in groundwater goes to the fact that nitrate is known to be a part of nitrogen cycle. When we take up nitrate into our body, nitrate is converted into nitrite due to activity of some of bacteria that lives in our digestion system. Then nitrite can oxidize the ferrous hemoglobin into ferric hemoglobin. And unlike ferrous hemoglobin, ferric hemoglobin cannot carry oxygen very well. Therefore, the symptoms for a disease called blue baby syndrome arises, which can be very dangerous and even fatal, especially for younger children. Unfortunately, the problem of having high levels of nitrate is widely spread around the United States. And as you can see over here in this map, you can see that this risk is much higher in the Midwest area region of the United States. and that is probably due to agricultural and farming activities that are taking place in this area. Therefore, you can say that fast and accurate methods for detection of concentration of nitrate is highly in demand. The current EPA-approved method for detection of concentration of nitrate is based on spectrometry. So in this case, the nitrate containing solution is passed through a column that is filled with the alloy of copper and cadmium. And in this way, nitrate is reduced into nitrite. Then the produced nitrite will be exposed to sulfonin amide. And nitrite will oxidize this compound into a diazonium compound. Then in presence of ethylene diamine, you will form a type of ozonium compound which has a strong adsorption band at around 543 nanometers. And in this way, you can evaluate the concentration of the azo compound, and in this way, you can back calculate the concentration of nitrate. However, you can say that this method cannot satisfy the goal of this project, which was real-time monitoring of the concentration of nitrate in the environmental samples. So in order to address this issue, we started to making a nanostructured silver modified ultramicro-electrode for detection of nitrate. Ultramicro-electrodes are referring to the type of electrodes that have a dimensions of 25 micrometers or smaller. Like other types of electrode, ultramicro-electrodes can be purchased from suppliers like CHI. However, you can also fabricate this type of electrodes in the lab. In order to make this type of electrodes, first you have to seal one end of a quartz capillary tube. Then you have to insert a micro wire inside the tube. Then you have to place that into a heating element and start heating the quartz. So when you heat the quartz, you will partially melt the quartz, and as a result, the quartz will start to seal around the micro wire. Then you have to make the contact of the electrode, and you can do this by inserting a copper wire into the capillary tube, and then you have to use a type of conductive glue like silver epoxy in order to make the contact between the micro wire and the copper wire. Lastly, you have to polish the electrode until the micro wire gets out of the quartz. In this case, we made two types of ultramicro electrodes. One time by placing a silver micro wire inside the capillary tube, and the second time by placing a carbon fiber inside the capillary tube. Then what we did was we started to deposit silver onto the surface of the electrode, and we did this in order to make the electrodes activate toward concentration of nitrate. So to do this, we placed the electrodes inside a silver containing solution, and we applied a negative potential to the electrode, and we forced the silver to deposit onto the surface of our electrode. Then we started to study the changes on the surface area of the electrode. You know, when you run cyclic voltammetry in a capacitative potential regime, which means a regime that no Faradic reaction occurs, the peak current of the cyclic voltammogram will be proportional to the charging capacity of the electrode as well as the CV scan rate. Furthermore, you know that the charging capacity of the electrode is proportional to the surface area of the electrode. Therefore, if you can compare the charging capacity of the electrode before and after modification of it with the silver structures, you can get some idea of how much the surface area has increased. So as you can see on these two pictures on the top, you can see that for the carbon fiber electrode, we observe that this increasement is by 8 times, and it was by 15 times on the silver wire microelectrode. Then we collected SEM images of the electrode. So what you see here is the cross-section image that we got with SEM. Pictures A and B are A and D are showing the bare carbon fiber microelectrode and bare silver wire microelectrode. And as you can see, the dimension for the carbon fiber microelectrode was around 10 micrometers, and for the silver wire it was around 15 micrometers. Then pictures B, C, E, and F are showing the SEM images for the deposited silver on both carbon fiber and silver wire electrodes in 2 different magnifications. And as you can see, the deposited silver appears to have some type of nanostructure, and they have some type of dendritic growth. Then we studied the response of the sensor toward concentration of nitrate. And we did this by introducing different concentrations of the nitrate to the sensor and collecting the corresponding voltammogram. Then we calculated the peak current for the CVs, and we showed that as a function of concentration of nitrate. And in this way, we generated the calibration curve for the sensors. As you can see, we could get the limit of detection of around 3 to 5 micromolar for both of the sensors. And if you think of the MCL, or the maximum contamination level of the nitrate, which is 10 ppm as N in nitrate, which is almost equal to 726 microliters of nitrate, you can say that this value is within the linear range of the sensor. Therefore, this sensor can be used for detection of nitrate. Furthermore, the linear range of this sensor is comparable to the EPA approved method. Therefore, you can say that this method can be used as an alternative method for detection of concentration of nitrates. Then we try to see if the sensor can be used for detection of nitrate in the real world. So in this case, we made a synthetic aquifer sample based on what was reported from Water Resources Investigation Report from Department of the Interior, showing the main components of South Dakota's surface water. As you can see on these images, we basically saw that the sensor is selective enough for detection of concentration of nitrate in this complex medium. Therefore, we can say that these sensors can be used for detection of nitrate in the real world. However, although you can think that these sensors appear to be selective enough to determine nitrate in the real world, but since we are talking about microelectrodes, you might think that using these microelectrodes in the real world might not be very practical. So in order to address this issue, we tried to see if the same idea can be applied onto a disposable paper electrode. The paper electrodes that you can see pictures of them over here are type of relatively cheap and commercially available electrode that can be run with a handheld potentiostat. So therefore, you can say that these type of electrodes can be easily used for detection of nitrate in the real world. So we technically applied the same idea here. We started by depositing silver onto the electrode by applying a negative potential to our electrode when the electrodes were inserted into a silver solution. And here you can see the SEM image for the deposited particles, showing that the deposited silver appears to have some particle shapes. After that, we started to optimize different parameters that affects detection of nitrate. The first thing that we optimized was the type of electrochemical technique that we can use for detection of nitrate. So in this case, we studied the sensor response with linear sweep voltammetry, or LSV, and a square wave voltammetry, or SWV. And as you can see here in this picture, we technically observed that when we interrogate the sensor with SWV, we could get a much sharper peak for reduction of nitrate compared to LSV. Therefore, we decided to keep on using SWV. The next thing that has to be optimized was the amount of silver that was deposited onto the electrode. As you can see over here in this image, we technically observed that by increasing the time that we were depositing silver onto the electrode, we could get a sharper peak for reduction of nitrate in the same concentration. However, going beyond 30 seconds for deposition of silver was not practical since silver was tending to come off the surface of the electrode when it was deposited for longer times. Another factor that has to be considered was the effect of ionic strength. So you can think that when you're collecting water samples in the real world, they might have different amounts of salt that is dissolved in it. Therefore, the ionic strength of the samples might be different. Therefore, we had to make sure that the sensor that we have developed is sensitive toward nitrate in a variety of ionic strengths. And as you can see over here, we technically observe that this sensor can be used for detection of concentration of nitrate in both high and low ionic strengths. Another factor that you have to consider is effect of sample temperature. Again, if you think of the water samples that you're analyzing in the real world, you can think that the temperature of water in these samples might be different. So we had to make sure that this sensor can be used for detection of nitrate in a variety of temperatures. And here you can see the result that we got for keeping the concentration of nitrate constant and varying the temperature of the sample. And as you can see, we almost observed that the response of the sensor toward concentration of nitrate is independent of temperature of the sample. And lastly, we calibrated the sensor, and we did this by the water samples that we got from Nebraska Public Health Environmental Lab. These water samples were real water samples that were collected from farms all around Nebraska, and the concentration of nitrate in these samples were evaluated with other techniques. As you can see, we could get a very nice linear calibration curve for the concentration of nitrate with this sensor. And if you think of the MCL level of nitrate, which is 10 ppm, you can say that 10 ppm is within the linear range of this sensor. Therefore, the sensor can be used for detection of nitrate in the water samples. Furthermore, the linear range of the sensor is also comparable to the EPA-approved method, so you can say that the method can potentially be used as an alternative method for detection of concentration of nitrate. So in conclusion, we showed that both microelectrodes and paper-based electrodes can be used for detection of nitrate. Both of the sensors appears to have low limit of detection and fast response toward concentration of nitrate. The sensors could be used in both high and low ionic strengths, and they work independent of temperature of water. Therefore, both of the sensors can be used for detection of nitrate in the real-world samples. We are still working on improving the performance of the sensors. One of the things that we are currently working on is to find a type of pre-treatment method in order to improve the stability of the sensor. Furthermore, we are also investigating methods in order to increase the lifetime and also increase and also to identify some ways to store the samples and also store the sensors for a longer time. And besides this, we are also working on some other electrochemical methods for detection of some types of heavy metals like lead, cadmium, or arsenic. And by this, I want to thank you for your attention to my talk.
Thank you, Hamid, and thank you to all of our presenters here. I'm going to go back to my screen and remind everyone of you can visit LinkedIn, and if you don't have an account, it's completely free to join. You may even be able to log in with an existing Facebook or Gmail account, and you don't even need to set up a profile. You just need to be able to have an account so that you can participate in our group. You'll need to request to join the group where you can submit questions to our presenters. I also want to thank Anna Seeger from WINS, Anna Seeger from DeRISK, Selena Dozier from WINS, and Kayvon Malachi from RESEAU for helping to organize this webinar series. and I look forward to visiting with you again in November. That date will be announced shortly. Again, this is being recorded, and we'll have that up as soon as we can within the next week or two. Thank you again for visiting with us today, and I hope you learned something new. Have a great week.